Our people must be well informed with the truth for us to make educated decisions. It's time to take our nation back.
War. War is the scourge of mankind. Winston Churchill once said that men were the only animals on the planet that periodically set out to kill each other. The wars of the 20th century killed more than 100 million people. In World War I, most of the deaths were military, that is, soldiers died. In the Second World War, millions of civilians joined their soldiers in death. Yet for some reason, mankind cannot avoid it. When asked in 1917 why the horrific losses in France did not stop the fighting, George Bernard Shaw, the famous playwright, answered, "Because men do not mind dying." In this episode, we will talk about war, not the maps or the battles, but what war means and what it does to us. War abroad and potentially war at home. Abraham Lincoln once said the challenge in foreign policy was to link the contingencies of power with the principles of justice. Before going to war, U.S. national command authorities need to answer several important questions in that context. First, what is the purpose of the war? What are the critical U.S. national interests at risk that justify American military action? Is the purpose of the war legal in a constitutional context? Is American military action legitimate in the eyes of the world? What is the true character of the war that Americans are being asked to fight? And how will Washington end the war and get our troops out? Is the war likely to run out of control, expand suddenly until it engulfs more nations and regions? Can U.S. military power actually decisively win the war? We tend to forget that war is always a predator. It consumes our best, our strength, and our resources. But its most terrible damage is often unseen. It forces American society to embrace brutality, to justify atrocity, to become something harder, colder, less human. It twists our values, creating a moral distortion field that warps our national character long after the fighting stops. These are the things that we want to touch on. This episode on war will address all of these questions. Well, as I mentioned before, there aren't very many people that I trust more than Judge Napolitano when it comes to asking questions about legality. And this is a question that doesn't seem to come up much, Judge. We really appreciate you coming on to talk to us. We're listening to the drums beat for war with Iran. We're listening to senators talking openly about attacking Iran. Today, early this morning, Senator Fetterman said we should provide Israel whatever it needs, essentially to annihilate Iran's capability to threaten the whole region, but most important, Israel. There's no debate. No one ever brings up whether or not there should be a declaration of war before we do anything. So I wondered if you'd talk about that. Tell us where we are, and is this just post-constitutional America?
One could argue that we are in a post-constitutional America, that formally the Constitution exists. We do have a Congress, we do have a president, we do have a judiciary, but functionally, the Congress looks the other way when the president does whatever he wants. I say this as somebody that knows and likes President Trump and has been with him many times. You, of course, worked for him when you were in the Defense Department in his first term, but it gives every indication, nevertheless, of abandoning constitutional principles. Now, of what constitutional principles do we speak? That is, the Congress declares war, the president wages war. He only wages a war that the Congress declares. That is at least the theory of James Madison when he crafted the Constitution as he did. Madison himself said If the president could both declare war and wage war, he wouldn't be a president, he would be a prince. Nevertheless, you know better than I and better than anybody watching us now the number of wars America has fought since World War II. Not a single one of them was ever declared. The last declaration of war was December 8th, 1941. We all know what that was about. Congress has enacted authorization to use military force, which it claims is the legal equivalent of a declaration of war. It's not, because it doesn't have an endpoint. When Congress declared war on Japan and Italy and Germany in December of 1941, those declarations had an endpoint. They ended upon the surrender of those two countries. The two authorizations for use of military force, the one for Afghanistan and the one for Iraq, are both still extant. And presidents as late as Trump in his first term and Biden in his single term have relied on those authorizations to justify military action. So with that as a background, can the United States of America legally fight a war against Iran? The answer, without a declaration of war, the answer is no. Can the Congress declare war on Iran? The answer is no, not legally, because Iran does not pose a threat to the United States, and the United States has signed treaties that limit its war declaration power to those who pose a grave threat to the national security of the United States. You and I both know Iran poses no threat whatsoever to the national security of the United States. Do we have a treaty with Israel which obliges us to defend it? No, we do not. We have no treaty whatsoever with Israel. So that's where we are at this moment.
So, Judge, it strikes me that you're describing Congress as a club of fugitives from accountability.
Definitely is a club of fugitives from accountability. I'll give you a fun example. I was on air at Fox News with the longtime congressman from Harlem, Charlie Rangel, who talked like this. It was a real character. And while we were on air, President Obama went on international television from Brazil, which is where he was visiting at the time, to announce that the United States was bombing Libya. I looked at Rangel. I said, "Is this a declaration of war?" And he said, "No." I said, "What are you guys going to do about it?" He said, "Nothing. If he successfully gets rid of Gaddafi, we'll cheer him on. And if it's a disaster, we can wash our hands of it." That is an example of how Congress views, its war-making powers. It doesn't want to get involved.
Well, there's another matter that's very important, and I know your background. You are more than just a legal scholar. You have quite a lot of depth in philosophy, and one of the things that certainly in my generation and yours that we studied in graduate school, whether you were studying international relations or law or anything else or political science, was the notion of just war theory. And just war theory seems to have fallen by the wayside. I've actually talked to people in graduate school. They say, "Oh, nobody bothers with that." And I've said, "Well, have you heard of it?" "Oh, yeah, yeah, we've heard of it, but we don't pay any attention to it." I wonder if you could take us through that and explain to Americans listening what is meant by a just war doctrine.
So just war theory presumes that the cause of the war is to correct a grave injustice, that the war itself is a last resort, meaning all other means to avoid violence have been addressed, that the parties waging the war are a competent authority. We're not talking about a militia now. We're talking about agents of a legitimate government, and that there is a right intention to the war. So the purpose of the war is not to annihilate human beings, but to bring about justice and peace. Just cause, last resort, competent authority, right intention. Now, this is not just theory. This is into the Geneva Conventions, and it's into the United Nations Charter. So if a nation has signed onto the Geneva Conventions, which Israel, Iran, Ukraine, Russia have, if a nation has signed onto the UN Charter, which is a treaty ratified by all those countries, including the United States, it is at least theoretically under international law bound by those 4 points: just cause, last resort, competent authority, right, intention. So if the intention of the war was to eradicate a peoples, that is obviously not a right intention. The intention can only be to correct a grave injustice. Second part of just war theory is the manner in which the war is fought. This is not articulated in the UN Charter. This requires proportionality. You can't use more force than is necessary. This requires a probability of success and establishing a goal that is reasonably achievable. And this requires just means, meaning the means for fighting the war cannot be greater than that which is necessary to correct the grave injustice. So if the purpose of the war is genocide, it doesn't comply with any of these terms whatsoever.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because during the Second World War, at one point, Admiral Leahy, who was effectively the acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he was really the military aide and advisor to Franklin Roosevelt, called in General Arnold of the U.S. Army Air Corps and General Marshall of the U.S. Army and said to them, "Gentlemen, don't you understand something? We want to live with the Germans and the Japanese when this war ends." And they looked at him, stared at him with blank faces. He said, "What I'm talking about is the bombing campaigns. You are killing vast numbers of people who, frankly, are irrelevant to the war effort. These people have families. These people have long memories. We don't want to have to fight them for years. We don't want to have bad relations in the future as a result. You've got to curb this bombing campaign." Well, this was really foreign to them because the instructions they thought they had from the president were to essentially flatten Germany, flatten Japan, end the war. Now, in retrospect, we got all these studies that say bombing made things worse. That while it did some good, it hurt the Germans in terms of gasoline, petroleum, oil products, and so forth, even though they were able to overcome some of that. But in the final analysis, war production in the country continued to increase until the war ended. So killing all of these people in these various areas didn't help matters. It actually strengthened support for the regime in Tokyo and for the regime in Berlin. But that seems to have gone by the wayside because we did something very similar to that in Vietnam, did we not?
Yes, yes, we did. We used napalm to burn villages and destroy cities and towns. The carpet bombing, you know history better than I do. The carpet bombing of Dresden and Munich and the other cities in Germany was profoundly immoral and profoundly unlawful. That was expressly authorized by Churchill and FDR. What the Israeli Defense Forces are doing in Gaza violates every single one of these principles. And if the United States of America were to attack Tehran, it would violate all of these principles because there is no just cause. There is no effort to avoid this and make war a last resort. There isn't even any right intention. The intention in there is to make sure that the Israelis are the only people, even if unlawfully, in the area to have a nuclear weapon. So I don't know where any of this is going to go, Colonel. If I had to predict, it would be that under the presidency of Donald Trump, the Congress looks the other way, just as it has been looking the other way during his first 100 some odd days in office as he usurps power from them via his signing his name on executive orders.
Judge, I don't think anybody could have summed up the situation better than you. I think you're right. And all of us in this country are condemned to be bystanders at the decision-making process that's out of our hands because the people that represent us have decided to do what you described, look the other way.
People that represent us in the Congress are largely controlled by the donor class in America that has financed their campaigns, that gave Prime Minister Netanyahu, a war criminal, 58 standing ovations in a 56-minute address. There is no reason to believe that if President Trump were to ask for a declaration of war, these people would vote however the donor class wanted them to. It's the absolute perversion of democracy by money.
Right. No, as I said, you've eloquently stated the problem. And the sad part is there's a certain lack of humanity in all of this that's really disturbing because there doesn't seem to be any sense of life and death and the consequences for the people that have to suffer from this. There's also the danger with this new war, as you know, it could easily spread and find its way here to the United States. Hopefully, Americans will think about that.
Hopefully, Americans will think about it, and hopefully there will be a great debate, because if there is a great debate, it'll become obvious to any clear-thinking person that there is no a national security basis whatsoever for attacking Iran. And the demands that the United States negotiators are making on Iran in order to satisfy Prime Minister Netanyahu are so unrealistic, Iran would never accept them. That Iran should become like Libya, I'm quoting Prime Minister Netanyahu, totally defenseless, not only without nuclear weapons, but without the ability to defend itself whatsoever. Why should it do that when it has a bellicose neighbor whose history of bellicosity is unrivaled in the post-World War II era, and who has nuclear weapons, which they threaten to use?
I suppose the choice for everyone who is opposed to them is suicide or suicide. That's it, because there's no in between. There is no negotiated outcome. Either you submit unconditionally or we will destroy you. It's the kind of thing that Genghis Khan did. It's not the sort of thing that we want to practice today or that we should support. Judge, thank you so much. Appreciate it. And talk to you soon.
It's a pleasure, Colonel. Thank you for having me on your show.
You know, now we're going to talk to a man who's been through it. This is a man with 13 years of experience in the Army and the Marines. He's also a combat veteran. His name is Dan McKnight, and he's the chairman of Bring Our Troops Home. What a great idea. I love it when the title tells you exactly what the organization is about. Okay, so Dan, you're here to talk with us, and we want to know first and foremost about the organization and what's behind it. Would you tell us?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. The organization, we're in our 6th year. We started in 2019 when we had a president who was talking about not starting new wars, and a bunch of combat veterans from the global war on terror. We got together and decided to go to D.C. and plead our case to our congressmen and senators, asking them to use this opportunity with a commander-in-chief that wasn't talking about new wars to maybe even bring troops home. And every single senator and congressman we met with politely took a picture with us and told us that they support the troops. They even pointed to the yellow ribbon on their door. And then they turned right around and walked us out the door and continued to support everything of the modern military-industrial complex wanted. And so we decided to take our organization and leave D.C. And we left with 2 goals. One, we wanted to go back to Wyoming and defeat Liz Cheney because she had told us that we would never leave Afghanistan as long as she was in power. And we accomplished that. And then we wanted to find a way for the states to regain their authority over matters of war. The National Guard has become the easy button for our foreign policy. And at the end of the Syrian war last December, I guess not really the technical end, but the fall of the Assad regime, 58% of the boots on the ground in Syria were from the National Guard. And so we found this bill is called Defend the Guard. It's very simple legislation. And it's done at the state level through the state legislatures, giving the governor the authority to withhold the National Guard from being called into federal service unless it's for one of the clearly identified purposes in the Constitution or in federal law. And if they want the National Guard to be activated to go fight in a war or to serve as an instrumentality of war, then Congress has to do their job first and declare war, which they haven't done since 1942. And we now have the bill in over 30 states. We're about to put it on the governor's desk in Arizona, hopefully this week. It's about ready to go before a full floor vote in Texas, maybe this week or next. But we are running into opposition. There is heavy opposition from the National Guard Bureau and the military-industrial complex lobbyists. But we are pushing forward anyway. Combat veterans who've been there, who've seen the human cost of war, are the ones standing up and saying enough is enough.
Well, I think that's brilliant, and I'm sure most of the audience listening to you will agree with that. Now, I have to stop for a second and say something I would normally never say, which is that you got to give Liz Cheney credit for one thing. She was honest for a
She's
change.
honest, 100%. She was the only one that
She told you the truth. Yeah, what she was going to do. The rest are very much like her, let's face it, but they don't tell the truth. You know, right now, people are wondering what's going to happen with regard to Iran. And one of the points that many analysts, I'm by no means the only one, have tried to put across is this is the potential for a war that could drag on for a long time. And it would inevitably result in some sort of pressure to invade the country.
Yep.
We should have learned by now, and I think we've had a recent lesson with the bombing of the Houthis, that you're not going to get very far unless you're willing to go in on the ground and root out the enemy. Now, I'm not somebody who thinks that's what we should consider doing anywhere in the Middle East. I think we did a lot of that, and it didn't work out very well for reasons that have nothing to do with soldiers, sailors, airmen, or Marines, and everything to do with the people at the top who can't define an attainable objective and make it real. But tell us something. You're talking to lots of people. What sort of feedback do you get about Iran, especially from the National Guard? Because it's impossible right now, given the small numbers of soldiers in the regular army, for the army to undertake anything of significance without the Guard.
No, absolutely. And, in the height of the global war on terror, when we were fighting in multiple countries, the National Guard made up about 50% of the boots on the ground in that global war. And in order for us to invade Iran, we would need a massive ground force. I think you know this as a former armor commander. You know that there has to be a ground invasion. Iran is a geographical oddity. You can't just fight from the coast. You can't fight from the air. You'd have to have a massive ground invasion. And there was an interesting article put out by a colonel, and I can't remember his name, from the Marine Corps about a week and a half ago, talking about how the Marines are no longer equipped to be that expeditionary amphibious warfare group because they've been doing these static wars and fighting and clearing streets in Ramadi and Iraq and Afghanistan. They're no longer equipped to overtake a country from the sea and provide that ground security for the United States military to come in and clean up the end of a war. And so if our expeditionary amphibious forces, the Marine Corps, are elite, aren't able to do that, what makes anybody think that we would be able to go into Iran and take over a massive country and do it without the use of the state and militia, the National Guard, because the active duty military is so overspent. They're so depleted. They're so spread out. I think there's 50-ish, maybe 60,000 troops within striking distance of Iran in the Middle East right now on anywhere from 20 to 40 bases, depending on whose numbers you look at. And what's funny is on those bases, they're permanently stocked and staffed by National Guard troops on rotation. And so the National Guard has become this easy button. And you've been one of the clearest voices, Colonel, talking about how U.S. foreign policy is often hijacked by special interests, particularly the influence of foreign lobbies and the military-industrial complex. And I agree with your assessment. And that's one of the reasons that we're pushing this Defend the Guard legislation. This law would not ban the deployments or tie the president's hands in any way. It would simply say that the National Guard troops can't be sent into combat without a declaration of war from Congress. And you know this, I know this, and I think most of America know this. Congress does not have the stones or the backbone to do what's right and what their most solemn duty is, to take control in matters of war. They're cowards, and they'll never do it without being forced. And the only way we can force it from the state level, from the combat veteran level, is to pass state-based legislation like this.
Well, just so everyone listening knows, you're talking about Colonel Gary Anderson. I know him. He's a very solid Marine, and all the comments and observations he makes are valid. unfortunately, there's nobody looking carefully at the Marines and the Army as the ground force and looking at ways they should be organized, equipped, and trained to fight. It's a huge problem. And I think part of it is because of what you described earlier. We've had 20 plus years of interaction with opponents who, frankly, let's face it, are not very capable, not very formidable, but they can do a lot of damage to you if you're dumb enough to occupy and present a target array to them, which is what we did and never needed to do. So one of the lessons I think of history is that if you don't have to occupy a place, by all means, don't do it. And that also ties up whomever we've got. Now, the first major commitment of the National Guard after National Guard legislation was passed under President Wilson was to deploy 100,000 guardsmen on the border with Mexico. Very few people know that. And they sent 25, 30,000 troops from the regular army into Mexico in a punitive expedition to try and drive the criminality and the revolutionary conflict that was raging in Mexico from the border further to the south. And that was, I think, on the whole, successful. But that was the first time the Guard was used, and the argument was the National Guard exists to defend the United States. It does. It doesn't exist to invade other people's countries.
Yep. Yeah, the Constitution says that the National Guard could be called into federal service to put down an insurrection, to repel an invasion, or to enforce the laws of the Union. That's it. It's pretty clear. And nowhere in there does it say to staff a forward operating base in Djibouti, Africa. Nowhere does it say that the National Guard should be the air bridge providing all the fuel for the C-130s and the other cargo aircraft flying over the Atlantic as an instrumentality of war. If they want the National Guard to fill that role, then we either need to amend the federal code, Title 10, and add that as one of the authorized purposes, or we need to follow what the founders of the Constitution said, and that the Congress should be giving the informed consent of the people of America before we head off headlong into these wars of choice.
Absolutely. And I think the truth is, if the American people were asked right now or had been asked in the past, they wouldn't have gone anywhere. And I don't think we would have had anybody interested in staying in Iraq for more than about 6 months. And frankly, if we had left in 6 months, no one would have cared. We'd have been out and we would have declared that a success story. Well, right now, we're looking at this Iranian issue, and I don't see any evidence that anybody in Congress is going to ask their constituents really what they think.
No.
And that's sad. It's tragic. And there will be no request for a debate. Usually, at least historically in the United States, before we did something, there was a debate in the Senate and the House. We don't expect to see any debate at this point.
No, absolutely not. I think the last time we even considered a declaration of war would have been for Iraq, and Congressman Ron Paul brought the declaration of war to the Congress himself and said, I will present this because this is the right way. I will vote against it, but we're going to do this the right way. And they laughed him out of the room. And then when Obama went in 2014 and asked for authorization for the war in Syria, Congress told him, no, we're not going to give you that authorization. We're war weary from Iraq and from the expansion of that war. And what did Obama do? He went anyway. And so we've made a mockery of the war powers, which the founding fathers spent more time deliberating the war powers than any other part of the Constitution. It's not meant to be a throwaway. And we've been in meetings with National Guard generals, 2- and 3-star generals in their dress uniforms, sitting across the table from us, telling us, you're right, Dan, defend the Guard is constitutional, but we just don't do it that way anymore. And they're just okay with it. And so, Colonel, we've got a problem in this country. It's going to take the citizens. It's going to take us to rise up and demand that we do it the right way. We can't do it in D.C. That's not favorable ground. I think we have to do it at the states in order to protect us from fighting in Iran or Yemen or the Horn of Africa or, heaven forbid, Gaza and Israel. If we want to keep America out of those wars, the citizens have to regain our rights, our authority over our Congress.
But you've also sort of hit on something that I think is important for people to understand. Someone who becomes a general in the National Guard does not get there by accident. They get there because they're politically useful.
That's right.
They are friends with the governor, probably friends with the senators. They're not going to allow someone to come to a position of influence in the Guard who's going to raise the questions you have. So that's part of the problem. I hear people talk all the time about problems with generals in the Army and admirals and so forth. They tend to forget the Guard. And I would say that both elements now are almost equally politicized.
Sure. And you don't become a general in the National Guard without you have to pass the FedRec board. So your governor may appoint you to be the adjutant general and give you that first or second star, but you don't get federally recognized unless the Department of Defense signs off and christens you as one of theirs. And it just shows you that the general class of the military, it is a cloning structure. Find somebody that thinks like you, acts like you, and will kiss the right rear ends like you, and drag them up through the ranks with you. And that's how you get that next star, is by promoting the one star below you. And it's just a self-licking ice cream cone.
Yeah. Well, it's an ice cream cone I don't want to order up.
No, thank you.
And I know you don't, and I don't think the American people want it.
Right.
Dan, thanks so much for talking to us.
Oh,
We
thank you.
deeply appreciate it, and I wish you all the best. Great seeing you this morning. Keep
You as
up,
well.
keep up the fight, no matter how hopeless it may seem.
It's never hopeless. It's just difficult.
Never. Thanks, Dan.
You bet. Thank you.
We've had a number of guests thus far who've told us a lot of things about the United States, particularly the problems, military problems, legal problems associated with our routine inclination to completely ignore the Constitution. I wanted to turn now to someone who really understands the region and knows a great deal about Iran. This is Dr. Arta Moini. He's an international relations scholar and currently the managing director at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy in Washington, D.C. Dr. Moini, we are bombarded every day with the notion that Iran's government, its armed forces, its population, all together collectively are committed one way or another to the inevitable destruction of the lives of 6 million Jews in Israel. Of course, the 6 million figure resonates with Americans because that's the number of Jews killed during the Holocaust. How do you respond to that? Tell us what the story is. How real is that? How imaginary is it? We just don't know.
The notion that Iran is committed to killing any Jews, let alone 6 million of them, it's preposterous. And it's part of a desperate campaign by some who never want stability in the region. Benjamin Netanyahu is now desperate. He feels that his support base domestically, his relationship with Donald Trump himself is challenged, is fraught with a lot of issues, and he's using these tactics and the mythology that's surrounded about Iran to be able to push this notion that Iran is frankly a dangerous country that will annihilate not only the Jews, but the state of Israel. Now, Iran and the Islamic Republic is and has been a problem in the region. I'm not going to deny that, but what I'm going to say is that the Iranian regime today has very different priorities than what it did in 1979. Is at a very different stage, and a lot of these bombardment that you spoke about is to create the notion of insecurity, ontological and physical, a notion that is just basically everyone needs to get down that Iran is the enemy. It's the enemy and friend distinction, and therefore no talking with the Iranians and possibly bombing them. So anything that goes towards that propagandist message is what you hear from Washington and Jerusalem.
Well, the interesting thing is that not only is Iran treated, as you know, as this implacable enemy of Israel, and by definition or implication, the United States, there has been no evolution in Iran. That the imams that rule the country are ruling it today as they did 30 years ago, 40 years ago, that, women are actively suppressed everywhere. In other words, we have this very dated picture. And can you update us a little bit on where things are in the country today versus where they were in 1979, and perhaps why?
Yes. So one thing is, first of all, I think there are a few myths that hopefully we can disperse with tonight or this afternoon. Number one is that the Islamic Republic of Iran today is the same country that it was in 1979. That is not true. Iran today is, first of all, the population is the most westernized population in the Middle East. This is why the Islamic Republic itself has had to adjust and readjust its course domestically, allowing some and more freedoms to women and others just by default, just because it has had to. And the way that Iran sees itself is even moving towards more pragmatic sensibilities. Again, the revolution, to remind your viewers, happened 46 years ago. Since then, we have had the collapse of the Soviet Union. We have had the rise of unipolarity. We have had the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We have had the changing structure of the international system, and we have had a complete realignment in the region. And for all the talk about the Abraham Accords, the biggest realignment is the changes happening within the region with Saudi Arabia and with the way that they are themselves pursuing the threats in the region. So today, the context, the field, the state of the field in the Middle East is completely different than it was in '79. The regime in Tehran has had to endure a lot of difficulties. It has changed a lot of its posture. But ultimately, what I want to get to is that Iran is not one of those. And Robert Kaplan has said that before. Is not one of those artificial countries that can disappear in the course of history. Iran is a civilizational state. It is mostly a cultural power, even before the political power that it has, and it will stay in the region, has staying power. So our approach to Iran cannot be our approach to smaller states. We have to understand Iran as we would Russia, as we would India, as we would these civilizational and cultural powers.
I think that's a very good way to look at Iran at the moment. By the way, in connection with Saudi Arabia, it's been announced that the Saudis talked to President Trump and indicated that they would like to develop nuclear power, potentially a nuclear weapon. And thus far, that has always been rejected by the United States on the grounds that Saudi Arabia first had to recognize the legitimacy of the state of Israel. It turns out that he's decided that's no longer required. Now, many are wondering what that means, because President Trump has flip-flopped a number of times on various issues. So we don't really know what that means for Israel at this point. But is there any reason why that would be objectionable to Iran, or how would Iran treat that development?
I mean, I think Iran takes, for better or for worse, the sort of the parameters of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Agreement, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, very seriously, in the sense that it sees its sovereign rights as part of that. And so Iran has been arguing that it has the right for civilian nuclear power and wants to develop nuclear fuel cycle. And so it can't turn around and say, our neighbors can't have it if you're Tehran. So I think that Iran will be comfortable with that if there's an understanding that Iran itself will be able to have its own domestic nuclear fuel cycle. And I believe that there's a lot of misconceptions, and that's the myth number two. The first myth was Iran today is the same as Iran it was in 1979. The second myth is that there's this idea that Iranian nuclear program is fundamentally different from other nuclear programs, whereas nuclear enrichment, nuclear power itself is a dual-use technology. Any country that has the know-how and develops the infrastructure for nuclear technology, for power plants, which President Trump has already recognized and admitted that Iran can have, despite a lot of misinformation. I think that's the line that President Trump has actively directed. And I think that message that Iran can have civil nuclear power means that ultimately there's a lot of people who say that that's the same as nuclear weapons, and they don't want to differentiate between a weapons program and a civil nuclear program, or a nuclear power, nuclear energy program.
Dr. Moini, there's another issue that comes up routinely in the American media, and that is that somehow or another, Iran is a quote-unquote multinational state, multi-ethnic state, that under severe bombing or severe threat from the United States and Israel, the various ethnic groups in the country, specifically the Baluchis in the south, the Arabs in the west, the Turkic peoples in the north, would jump at the opportunity to overthrow their Iranian masters and walk away from the government. Could you enlighten us as to what is real and what is not there?
So first of all, this gets me to the third myth, and I had three myths that I wanted to discuss, and you brought all of them up, so thank you. The third myth is that Iran is the most vulnerable that it has been in 40 years. And that is not true. it's true that Iran has, you know, there are certain quote unquote strategic losses in Syria as opposed and towards like Hezbollah. But this is a blessing in disguise, in my view, because Syria for Iran was like Ukraine for us. There was a lot of resources, a lot of power that was pushed in Syria to upstate a state that was incompetent. And so, by the fact that Iran has been partly forced, but also decided to let the Syrians be, ultimately because it had no choice, that has actually is going to have repercussions. It means that Iran has um, more resilience when it comes to the core national interest that it wants to protect. And so the idea that Iran is the weakest today is not true. And Israel itself has had a lot of military success, but has had a lot of trouble translating that military success into soft power and diplomatic clout.
Well, as a student and scholar of international relations, Hedley Bull wrote a book many, many years ago in the 70s called The Anarchical Society, in which he predicted the world would evolve into regions based on culture and strategic interest, and that these regions would replace this bipolar system that we'd lived with for so many years. I think that's happened. By the way, there's one last point, and this may be another myth that you want to explode. Iran is always asserted by the Israelis to be the leading terrorist exporter in the world. Most of this, of course, is based on their experience with Hezbollah, which is a creature of Israeli occupation, as you know, that came into being after the Israelis occupied southern Lebanon. Also, the Houthis and potentially other groups of Shiites in the Gulf. Talk a little bit about the fact that Iran does feel an obligation to co-religionists, and that's something that is not understood in the West.
Well, I think that's another part of the first myth that Iran is the same country that it was in 1979. I think, ironically, our policies have had a very different uh, implication for the Iranian regime. Our sanctions policy has empowered the IRGC by cutting off ordinary Iranians from the economy. And because of that, the IRGC actually has turned more pragmatic because it has a lot of hands in economics and in commerce. And so that has meant that the way that we think about or the sort of the region has to change because they ultimately want to protect they realized that they need to have the access to a strong economy. And that's something that a new group in Iran is increasingly for.
Well, if I could interrupt for 1 second, just for the majority of viewers so they understand, the IRGC is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and it is the both military and paramilitary arm of the government that is distinct and separate from the Iranian armed forces. It is the element that is projected beyond Iran's borders as opposed to the armed forces. So that it's important that people understand that.
Yeah, yeah, and thank you for that. I think that the IRGC is also increasingly a commercial and infrastructural power in Iran. It controls a big chunk of the Iranian economy, much larger than it did even 10 years ago, a lot of it because of sanctions. And the result of that is that when you have a lot of money in your hand and you're the middleman and you're doing projects, you become more pragmatic. So one of the changes, in fact, is that I think that part of this new nuclear negotiations has to be about that as well, in which America talks to the Iranians about the new realities. And Iran does not have the same interest in proxies that it did in the past. It needs to be pushed towards the direction of cutting off some of these proxies. I mean, Syria has already happened. Hezbollah ties in Iran are much weaker. I think there are certain red lines. Iraq is a red line. So we have to understand that have a sense of strategic realism, as J.D. Vance said, Vice President Vance, or understand that we need to have a strategic empathy about the red lines of our rivals and adversaries. And for the Iranians, there are two issues. They need to be able to domestically enrich for a nuclear fuel cycle that's domestic, and they are not going to give up influence and suzerainty over Iraq.
In view of what's happening in Gaza and what has already happened, do you really think that there could be peace in the region? And the reason I ask that is that there is this Greater Israel Project, which is inextricably intertwined with the mass murder in Gaza and potentially violence and murder in the West Bank. So, how do you arrive at a condition of cooperation, coexistence as an Israeli with the rest of the region while these things go on?
So I want to separate this is my view. I want to separate Benjamin Netanyahu from the long-term interests of Israel. I believe that Benjamin Netanyahu and his projects, his anti-Iranian vitriol has a very different trajectory than what's good for the interests of Israel. I think America and Israel will remain friends. I don't think that will continue under the Benjamin Netanyahu's government. I think there will be a change. But I think long-term trends in the region dictate something very different. We didn't speak much about Turkey, but I think the rise, what we saw in Syria and what we're seeing in the region is the rise of a revisionist Turkey that's far more Ottomanist or neo-Ottomanist, if you would like it. And the region that the West Asian, East Mediterranean region that historically Turkey or the government from Ankara has controlled has been the region that Israel also wants to control. So there is a lot of tension on the horizon between Israel and Turkey.
Where can people find you, find your work, so they can listen to you in the future?
Thank you so much. I have a Twitter account at Arta Moini. The name is at the bottom of the screen, ARTAMOEINI. We also have the website peacediplomacy.org. It's a nonpartisan think tank, a realist think tank. We care only about interest and how states tick based on interest. So if you like the less values-based foreign policy, a more America first foreign policy, and more of strategic empathy, please follow us at peacediplomacy.org. And you can also read some of our more essayist or more philosophical pieces at agonmag.com. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you so much, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here.
Today, we're talking to Congressman Andy Biggs from Arizona. He's the chairman of the Freedom Caucus. He's been in office since 2017. He has a long record of success as an attorney, a prosecutor, state senate. But what we want to talk to him about today is very, very simply war. A lot of us in this organization, Our Country, Our Choice, worry about waking up tomorrow morning and discovering that we're bombing Iran or someone else. And we were kind of interested to know, from your standpoint, Congressman, what's happening on the Hill? What's the pulse? What do people think? Is anybody debating anything?
As you know, this place is famous for having a lot of activity surrounding stasis, and that's really kind of where we are. I liken it to flies that are attacking a pile of cow manure, because there's a lot of busyness around there, and whatever's taking place is very slow, warm, and smells bad, and that's kind of what's happening here. So when we start talking about serious questions like war and international relations and what should happen, uh, there remains very little real action here on Capitol Hill.
Well, many years ago, a congressman named Rangel was asked, what do you do with the War Powers Act, and why haven't you ever declared war? And he said, well, it's like this. We let the president do what he wants. If he's successful, we cheer him. If he's not, well, then we condemn him. But in any case, it's not our problem. It's not our responsibility. Are you telling me that most people up there are just fugitives from accountability?
Oh, 100%, 100%. So, I formed with Rokon of California the War Powers Act to basically get rid of all the acts that have been implemented, but particularly post 9/11, right? The two acts there. And then I've also co-sponsored the official peace declaration on the Korean Peninsula, because I think that would be actually very helpful. And it would actually perhaps normalize both South Korea and give some impetus to normalize North Korea. But when you talk about, I'm going to give you a story to go back to your question, which was, are there a lot of risk avoiders here? Yes, this place is filled with risk avoiders, and it's been so for a long time. So I remember listening when you remember the American with Disabilities Act when that came down. It was filled with ambiguous terms and phrases, and I was listening to an interview of a member of Congress, and the reporter said, "Well, one of the criticisms is you guys didn't, with any degree of specificity, um, determine what certain terms mean, what the penalties should be, and how to do with that." And the individual said, there was a congressman responded and said, "We are handing that off to the courts," kind of what Rangel said, because, um, that way, he said, "we have someone to blame if this gets misinterpreted from what we each individually would want." And so that's really what it is this fear of standing up and saying, "I believe in X. Here's what I'm doing to further X." People around here often say, "I campaigned on X, and if X happens, that's great. If it doesn't happen, it's great, but somebody else is gonna get the blame." And that's how these people try to stay in Congress.
So it's not over the top to suggest that the president could convene a short meeting in the White House tonight with select members of the Senate and the House, say armed services committees, and simply announce, I made the decision to launch strikes tomorrow morning at these targets in Iran. And everybody would look at this and they would not raise objections. They would say, well, Mr. President, thank you for inviting us and thank you for showing us the targets. But they wouldn't raise objections. They'd sort of mumble and walk out. Is that about right?
There would be a few people who would stand up vociferously and say, no, or this shouldn't happen. But there would be a lot of people who would just casually let that go. And they, the fact that people like me, who are rank and filers, would not even know about it till the media reported on it, and then we'd have a briefing where Pentagon brass would come in and they would try to justify it with platitudes and not really give us the substance of why, what, or if. Um, it probably tells you all you need to know, because it doesn't matter whether it's this administration, the previous administration, the previous administration, the previous administration. This goes back, and it's all too common. And once we started moving in the Korean War, if you go back and you call it a police action instead of a war, you don't go through the normal uh, uh, declaration of war. You don't. The executive office doesn't start making the case why we need to go to war. Congress is not voting to put all of our resources behind it. Then you get the Korean War, which some people call the Forgotten War, or you get Vietnam, which was a morass, or you get Afghanistan, which goes on for 20 years, and then we leave in an embarrassing way and empower bad guys around the world. In other words, it is a feckless way to do things to avoid accountability to the American public. And I'm a big believer that if you have an emergency situation, I think the Constitution probably contemplates that. But if you're going to take an aggressive act of war, it seems to me that that needs to come to Congress first.
Oh, absolutely. You get no arguments from us. One quick question to sort of finish this out, because you've raised an important issue. When the Gulf of Tonkin resolution came up for discussion and ultimately for a vote in the Senate, no one in the Joint Chiefs, no one in the Joint Staff per se, made any attempt to clarify anything. There was a lieutenant colonel from the Navy, or lieutenant commander, I think, or commander from the Navy in the Pentagon, who did decide to call a senator on the Hill and say, look, this entire event is fiction. There is nothing to justify this action. Aren't you aware of that? Now, I don't remember who that senator was, but the senator, his response was, I don't think I can stop this. That's the sort of thing that I worry about now. And what you've done is you reassured us that, unfortunately, that condition is unchanged. You haven't had anybody from the military contact you, ask to meet with you under any circumstances and say, I just want to pass along to you the misgivings we have. We're not confident of what we've been asked to do. And I wanted you to know so that you could pass this along to your fellow members. You haven't had anything like that happen.
No, this is, and by the way, this is, I haven't been here. I'm not a lifer. I'm leaving after the term, but in the prior administration, we certainly never, received information until whatever had happened had happened. And then, of course, when people do that, it's just reactionary justification, right? It's not proactive justification where you say, we're going to take this act because. Instead, what they're saying is, we took this act because. And at that point, you wonder why they weren't telling us ahead of time that that was the case. Was it because they feared that they couldn't make that case? Was it because it was untrue? Um, and the skeptic in me and many of my colleagues, by the way, many of them it gets really raised. You look at some of this stuff and you go, why do you wait until afterwards to kind of reveal your justification? And I think it suggests, quite frankly, either one of two things: they don't trust Congress, which is that's a fair complaint, or they couldn't make the justification. Because when you declare war as constitutionally, and don't forget, this country was founded on the notion that you wouldn't even have a standing army. You would have a navy, perhaps, but no standing army. But when you look at that and you see where we've come, there's a reason perhaps that many nation states around the world are very concerned about our what they perceive to be aggressive. I've never, the more you look at it, you realize perhaps we are overly aggressive.
No, I don't think there's much doubt about that. And right now, there's a lot of concern overseas with our inconsistency. In other words, how do they know what we're going to do next? Our policies don't seem to survive the election cycle. And lately, we've been changing positions the way the teenagers go through TikTok. So that's a fair criticism of us. Do you see any evidence that that could change anytime soon?
Well, here's the way I would kind of characterize it. It seems to me that you can have what I call strategic inconsistency, um, or resulting in strategic confusion, on your adversaries. So, for instance, I do believe that China is not quite sure how to respond. I think Iran doesn't know how to respond. Does that cause increased hazard? I don't know. I don't know, because if they're afraid or have respect, I don't care which one it is, as long as they pull back on their activity or action or their aggressiveness. And so it's kind of a weird thing, but when I look back at other times in history, and to see what other presidents have done, there is on occasion a non-realist approach, a institutionalist approach, non-liberal approach. There is this kind of weird approach where it's kind of, I don't want to call it a neo-realist confusion. It's kind of a realist point of view that is resulting in confusion on the part of states around the world. And I don't, I'm not an institutionalist at all. I don't trust multilateral institutions as far as I can throw them. But what I will say is there is potential benefit with strategic confusion, but there's also potential hazard with strategic confusion.
Well, I'm sure the near future will tell us which has turned out to be the dominant outcome. Congressman, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to talk to us. We deeply appreciate it. Chairman of the Freedom Caucus and one of the people I admire most on the Hill, Congressman Andy Biggs of Arizona, thank you so much.
Thanks, Colonel Macgregor. It's good to be with you, and thanks for all you've done for this country. I appreciate it very much.
To this point in the program, we've talked a lot about war beyond the borders of the United States and its impact on our soldiers, impact on our population, what people think, how they behave, their lives, their health. We don't really address very often the potential for conflict inside our country. What would that look like? What would that have as an impact on us? And remember, inevitably, if there is serious conflict inside the United States, there'll be a certain expectation that the United States Army and other regular armed forces like the Marines will be involved. So we asked Lieutenant Colonel retired David Allen Grossman, an American author and trainer who conducts seminars on the psychology of lethal force, to talk to us. He was a colonel in the United States Army, but soon after leaving, he founded the Coology Research Group to give seminars about the physiological and the psychological effects of having to use lethal force for law enforcement officers and soldiers. Grossman's first book on killing, The Psychological Cost of Learning to Kill in War and Society, it's an analysis of the psychological processes involved with killing another human being. His second book on combat, The Psychology and Physiology of Deadly Conflict in War and in Peace, sets forth coping strategies for dealing with the physiological and psychological effects of violence for people who kill people in the line of duty. So I think Dave Grossman is ideally suited to help us navigate these troubled waters of potential for conflict inside the United States. Dave, why don't you tell us where you think the nation is? Because I'm not sure a lot of people are even thinking in these terms at this point.
Thanks, Colonel, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Big fan of what you've been doing across the years. The primary thing you're doing is so valuable is the American people need the truth. Now, I'm the only person ever certified to train law enforcement in all 50 states, every federal agency. I retired in December 97. Over 200 days a year, I've been on the road teaching primarily law enforcement, lots of military. And when we talk about crime, we've got to understand that we've been lied to, just totally misrepresented, because we measure the problem in the terms of the murder rate, the number of dead people. And the murder rate's being held down by medical technology. The number of dead people is a lie. If somebody said, your grandpa made 25 cents an hour, this job pays $25 an hour, you make 100 times more than your grandpa. We all see the lie. We all know you got to allow for inflation. But the Pew Research says, yeah, violent crime exploded in 2020, but it's still not as bad as previous years. We've got to understand that medical technology is holding down the violent crime. The number of dead people vastly underrepresents the problem. We got one good data point, a UMass Harvard study, peer-reviewed journal between the 1960s and the 1990s. Medical technology cut the murder rate to a third or quarter would otherwise be. That is to compare the murders in the 90s to the 60s. You got to multiply the 90s by a factor of 3 or 4. The number of dead people vastly misrepresents the situation. So it's much, much worse than it looks. And with all that said, we had the Ferguson effect. In 2015 and 16, we saw the homicides explode, equal to the worst we have ever seen throughout history. But when we allow for medical technology, the comparison completely breaks down. But then 2020, the George Floyd effect, the Minneapolis effect, we saw the single most horrendous explosion of homicides in the history of our nation. We saw a 30% annual increase in homicides. It's unlike anything we've ever seen before. And it's all about this narrative that the criminals are the good guys and the cops are the bad guys. And no civilization can survive when we tell our citizens that crime is good and law and order is bad.
We're seeing evidence for some of the same things being done here inside our country in terms of tactics and behavior that we witnessed in the Middle East.
Absolutely.
Why don't you explain that? Because I can't see how we on the military side stay out of this fight much longer.
we're going to see a dynamic where we've got to devote the kind of resources in the Defense Department to internal defense. The baseline of every civilization is public safety. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I call it the social contract. The Pharaoh, the Romans, us, here's the contract. You obey the law, you pay your taxes, we'll help keep you safe. If we can't keep them safe, why would they obey your damn law? Pay your damn taxes. So probably the most bizarre thing of all is a comparison between what the cops are reporting, Uniform Crime Report, and the National Crime Victimization Survey. When we take a look at things like aggravated assault, when cops say egg assault's down, and the survey says egg assault is up over 100%, and just year-over-year increase. So this chart alone, that the citizens know things have come unglued. The cops are being assassinated, and they don't go to that part of town, and that part of town don't report crime no more, and that part of town no longer has justice. We're looking at the systematic breakdown of our civilization, and it's not even being reported. We're looking at violence exploded, record number of cops murdered in the line of duty. We're looking at a variation between what's being reported to police on crime and what the citizens are saying in the survey is actually happening. The public needs information. Just like we have inflation-adjusted dollars, we need medically adjusted murders. When we do that, it will absolutely transform the way we see the situation. We've been in Afghanistan for 20 years, and we kept it to hell over there. I got a son with 9 combat tours, Spec Ops. I got a grandson who's deployed to Kuwait right now. And those boys are doing the best they can over there. But the fall of Afghanistan is one of the greatest tragedies and failures in history. It needs to be held accountable because we've been reading their mail for 20 years. The intel guys tell us, they keep saying, wait till the stupid Americans leave, and then it will be our turn, and we will do to them what we did to the Russians. Russia left Afghanistan, and we saw hospital massacres. We saw other things. They're looking at a symphonic attack. If you take out the hospital, you amplify the body count. But what we saw was the Bestland School massacre, September 1st, 2004. An entire school was held hostage. Exits are blocked by a handful of terrorists in place at a time. They go in, they don't go out. Now, just 1 or 2 people with concealed weapons in the crowd could have shot the idiot blocking the exit, and the hostages could have escaped like air out of a balloon. And they know that. They fear one thing, they fear failure, so they will seek the place where concealed carry is not allowed. And on top of that list is our schools. We won't even lock those damn doors. We won't put the laminate film on the glass, and we put a sign out front that says, we promise nobody here can shoot back. We could not have done a better job of inviting them to do to us what they did to Russians, to come slaughter our children. 1,000 kids are trapped in that gym. They will live and suffer and die in that gym for the next 3 days. A huge bomb is strapped to the basketball backboards on the little gym where you go 6 inches out of bounds in a basketball game, you hit the wall. Another bomb is strung between the 2 basketball backboards. The children are denied any water, any food, any bathroom facilities. Our mommies are there, babies and preschoolers are there in this big celebration. By the 3rd day, they're 1 day away from death by dehydration. This is the school. There's water fountains and bathrooms everywhere. Now, the terrorists have spent 3 days turning this school into a fortress. They barricaded and booby-trapped every ground floor entrance, every ground floor window, except the windows to the gym. In a previous attack, the Russians had used gas on them in the Nordos Theater. They're always learning. They're always evolving. They don't want to use gas, so they shot out and busted out the windows on both sides of the gym to get a flow of air. Other than that, it was physically impossible to get a ground floor window. They spent 3 days hardening the target. The children are 1 day away from death by dehydration. Nobody listening right now has gone 24 hours without a drop of hydration. What did it feel like in the 3rd day? Here's what it felt like. On the 1st day, they're urinating and defecating their shoes to have somewhere to put it. On the 3rd day, they sucked up the 3-day-old bottle of piss on top of the shit in their shoes to have somewhere to put it. They're mad with thirst. They're insane with thirst. 1 more day and they're all dead. But they knew the Russians would give them that day. Somebody should have been monitoring and jamming every radio, every cell phone frequency. Of course, they have people on the perimeter giving them intel. On the morning of the 3rd day, their Delta Force and their SEAL Team 6, Alpha and Wimple, their 2 most elite counterterrorism team, had arrived. They didn't have a plan yet. Most of them didn't have body armor, didn't have helmets, didn't have a choice. Could start slaughtering the children. On the morning of the 3rd day, one of the bombs on the backboard went off, blasting kids out the windows. 6 seconds later, the other bombs went off, blasting kids out the windows. The Russian Tier 1 Spec Ops simply charged from every direction. It was a gut-wrenching, heart-rending, 10-hour room-to-room nightmare, with terrorists using children as human shields. And the nation was stunned to the soul. Over 1,000 were hospitalized. The average American never even heard about it. This is what they do. They don't piss in your water. They don't sprinkle doo-doo over your skies. They're terrorists. Their goal is terror. Their tool is terror. Nothing creates terror like killing your children. They fear one thing. They fear failure. So they will seek the place where concealed carry is not allowed. And on top of that list is our schools. We won't even lock those damn doors. We won't put the laminate film on the glass, and we put a sign out front that says, "We promise nobody here can shoot back." We could not have done a better job of inviting them to do to us what they did to Russians, to come slaughter our children. And the only answer is armed, trained Americans on site all the time. Armed educators. The whole state of Utah has had armed educators for over 25 years. Concealed carry in the school in Utah is the same as concealed carry in the mall. Why would it change? 100% success. 85% of all counters, some armed educators. 100% success.
You've delivered a very sobering message today, and I think it's an important one, which is one of the reasons we wanted to talk to you. And it does fit in with this larger picture of conflict and how we deal with it. And we don't really think enough about what happens here at home. And you're painting a picture that says with almost complete certainty, we're going to face something like this, and it's probably going to happen sooner, not later.
Yes, sir. And the foundation's being laid. God bless you, and God bless America.
Instead of recognizing the limits of a nation's interests and resources, hubris, bravado, miscalculation, even ignorance in the ranks of politicians and senior military leaders drive millions of people into wars that no one ever wanted or thought was necessary. With that thought in mind, let's pause for a moment and think carefully about Memorial Day, which approaches at very high speed. Let's talk about the consequences of war and think about the people that have fought them in the past. Well, we came to Celebration, Florida for many reasons. It's a beautiful place. But this memorial is actually quite special. We're used to these giant figures, magnificent sculptures that you see in Washington, D.C. Small towns could never afford that sort of thing. But they absolutely wanted to pay tribute to the men from their community, as well as men from all over the country, and women, whose lives were sacrificed, and who came through the terrible trauma of war successfully and came home. I'm standing with my hand on the monument that is to the United States Army, having served in it for most of my adult life. And it's very special to me because this is the 250th anniversary of the Army, and many Americans aren't aware that before we became a nation state, in 1775, we were an army. And as long as that army marched and existed with Washington at its head, we were a country. So it was vital and essential that whatever Washington did, that army had to survive. And that was no easy task. We're going to close out this episode in Memorial Park in Celebration, Florida. Celebration, Florida is a wonderful town. It was actually designed and built by Disney to sort of immortalize the way America used to be, or at least the way he thought it was. And the Memorial Park that's behind me was really largely dedicated to the people that fought the Second World War as well as the Korean War. But for the most part, they're Second World War veterans whose names are here on the memorial. We are at a difficult point, what I would call a strategic inflection point in the history of the United States. We are a powerful state, but we are also a state that is troubled internally and has serious problems with deciding what its interests are. That's important because if we look back at history, most of the wars begin really as a result of vanity and self-deception, self-delusion that ultimately result in actions that should never have been taken. A good example is the First World War. First World War was a war that really everyone recognized should not be fought. In fact, all the belligerents regretted entering it, but they also deluded themselves into believing that this war would not be that destructive, that the war would not last that long, and that ultimately everyone would return home, as the German emperor said at the time, before the leads fell. Well, we all know that that didn't happen. We have a problem today in this country. There's a lot of hubris, bravado, miscalculation, and ignorance. And these are very dangerous attributes or characteristics. I wouldn't call them attributes. They're dangerous because we can make assumptions about wars and the people we fight that are simply fundamentally false. We've already been through that. Of course, who today remembers Iraq anymore? Iraq is a distant memory. That was a terrible failure, a strategic disaster for the United States and the people of the Middle East. When our troops finally left it in 2011, in order to get out without being shot to pieces, they left in the dead of night. Just imagine that. An American military organization that, in order to get out of Iraq without being shot up, leaves unannounced in the middle of the night. And then, of course, I don't need to remind everybody about what happened in Afghanistan. That was poorly organized, badly orchestrated, to be sure, but it was another huge fiasco for us and for the people that happen to live in Afghanistan, and I would argue for everybody in the region. We are on the verge of a potential war with Iran. We don't know if we're going to have one or not, but we're not asking any of the critical questions. Are we going to fight Iran, and if so, what is the purpose? And is that purpose actually attainable? But we need to debate it, and no one's bothering to debate it. Now, there are always lobbies. Some of those lobbies are foreign, as we know with the Israel lobby, and some of them are domestic. We have the defense industries and others. We have lots of people that want war for different kinds of reasons. But is this really what the American people want? Don't they deserve answers? What's the purpose? How do you plan to do it? And what is everything going to look like when you're through? We need to stop and think about where we were in 1941. A lot of people think we weren't prepared to do anything, but that's misleading. In 1932, 1933, when Douglas MacArthur was Chief of Staff, he convened the General Staff and he said, we know that we're going to fight another major war. We don't know where it will be, we don't know who the enemy will be, but we have to have a plan to be ready for it. And so he developed something called the Protective Mobilization Plan. That Protective Mobilization Plan made sure that in 1941, shortly before Pearl Harbor, we had 1.6 million soldiers in uniform. We also had 275,000 airmen ready to fly in whatever place they needed to. Now, it wasn't a pretty picture in the Pacific initially. We had lots to learn. It was tough when we got to Europe. But we need to remember those kinds of numbers. We don't have those numbers. They're not ready. And then we also need to remember that of the 1.6 million, there were 1 million casualties in the United States Army during the Second World War. Now, of course, it wasn't exclusively from that first 1.6 million, and that number climbed to plus 6 million. The reason that's important is we have to understand that war, once again, as we've seen in Ukraine, devours resources. It consumes humanity. It consumes steel. It consumes technology. It destroys economies. Now, Russia was prepared. It rapidly ramped up. It has survived the crucible of war. It is fresh from victory. It is in a position to help Iran, as is China. The Chinese have the largest manufacturing base in the world. They have produced in the last year and a half more ships than we have built since the 1950s. We're not ready for a war that could be regional or even global. We're not even close. And our situation at home is dire. We have to remember there is no victory without sacrifice, and the down payment on victory is always the same. It's American blood. We, at this point in time, should not fight any wars that are unnecessary to fight. This is the time to stop. At some point, it all must end. We should not allow any foreign lobby or any domestic lobby to drive us into a conflict that could consume millions of lives. Millions of Americans need to stand up and register their indignation with Washington and say, no, this is not what we want. And then finally, we're celebrating the United States Army's 250th birthday on 14 June. The United States Army, which is now roughly 450,000 men that are hard-pressed to even recruit for. This is not the time for a war. So, my Americans, my countrymen, think about these things. And remember back to Vietnam. Remember back to Iraq. Remember back to all of the places we've been where we have not done well because we didn't think through the key questions that I mentioned earlier. What's the purpose? How do we do it? And what's it going to look like when it's over? Don't listen to people that say, oh, we have a moral obligation. We have no moral obligations whatsoever in the Middle East to attack anybody. We do have a moral obligation to stand up against what's happening in Gaza. And I hope more and more Americans will realize that this terrible event in Gaza is a stain on the honor of our country. We should not be supporting it. We have a tough road ahead of us. There's no guarantee we'll get through the next several months without being dragged into a war in the Middle East or potentially elsewhere. Thanks for listening. God bless you, your families, and God bless the United States of America.
Our people must be well informed with the truth for us to make educated decisions. It's time to take our nation back.